You probably don't think too much about germanium, but maybe we should. Germanium is used in fiber optics, infrared optics, as well as a chemical for pet plastics. And it's also an electronic application for solar cells. Now, with me is Sam Rubin, the CEO of LightPath, to talk about germanium, why it's in the news, why the supply is such a concern. So, Sam, set the stage for us. Why is germanium so much in the news lately?
Absolutely. Thanks for bringing that up and having me over. Germanium is a raw material that is mined out of the ground, usually together with zinc mines, and is then refined in a very, I'd say, nasty or complicated process to get to the raw material. Then the raw material is used a lot in semiconductors, in solar cells, in fiber optics, and in infrared optics. Actually, infrared optics is the largest market for germanium, if you would. 30% of all germanium goes into infrared optics, while into semiconductor, it's only about 15 to 20% of the germanium goes in. The problem here is that over 90% of the germanium comes from two countries, Russia and China. Russia is out of the game since they took war with Ukraine and are sanctioned, and no one can do business with them. So supply of germanium from Russia is pretty much zero. China has been using now germanium as a lever against some of the sanctions against it with AI chips and semiconductor. A year and a half ago, they put in place some export control mechanism for germanium, which didn't really limit the export of germanium. It just was more created a mechanism where everyone that buys germanium from China has to get approval and a license. Now, a year and a half later, China announced that as a retaliation to the sanctions by the US, they're not going to export germanium to any US company and to any military use whatsoever, what's called dual use oftentimes. So before the war, before Russia went to war in Ukraine, it was something like 67% of the germanium was coming from China, 20 something percent, 25% from Russia. With Russia gone, China is 80 to 90% of the supply of germanium. Now, this isn't something that is easy to scale up elsewhere. You can't just go and overnight start mining and refining germanium in the US or in Europe or in other places. It's going to take some years. Many people are working on that now, and we're holding our fingers crossed, but we're looking at the time horizon of 3 to 5 years before really any meaningful output of germanium comes from any of these new ventures. So a solution is needed. Now, for semiconductors and solar cells, there isn't really an alternative. They have to use germanium. So any stockpiles of germanium that exist now in the West, or any recycled germanium, is very likely going to get prioritized to go into those two markets. In optics, it isn't as painful because there are alternative materials. Specifically, LightPath makes a glass called black diamond, which is an alternative to germanium and can be used instead of that. And so we're seeing a great influx and very encouraged by it of customers that want now to redesign their systems to use our glass instead of germanium, which in turn will free up available germanium for semiconductor and solar cells.
Wow, absolutely fascinating. And I think 99% of the public has no idea this is even
Yeah.
going on. And what an interesting role that LightPath is playing in this. So you have an exclusive license, right, with Naval Research for this
Yeah.
as well? Yeah.
So two of the materials that we make are more generic, BD6 and BD2. And there are some companies that make similar materials to those two. But unfortunately, no material is, as fit as germanium is in some applications. And so when you come to replace germanium, you really need to look at multiple materials. And BD6, what we call BD6 and others call IRG26, such, is a workhorse of the industry, but is not enough to replace germanium alone. And so you need supplementary materials. You need to put into your system lenses made from other materials so that together they can do the same function as a germanium lens was doing. For that, we have materials that are exclusive to us, that were developed at naval research laboratories, and we have an exclusive license to make them. We produce them here in the US, in Orlando, Florida, and that together with the more generic material like BD6 can be redesigned to replace germanium. And so this is something we started nearly 3 years ago in licensing it from NRL. Then 2 years ago in a collaboration with Defense Logistics Agency, which is in charge of supply of critical materials, as well as European Space Agency and other government agencies, to qualify these materials and accelerate them into market, getting ready for this day exactly. And the day has come, and we have now both the generic BD6 and the exclusive materials from NRL.
Yeah. And you also have some business with the Department of Defense to develop these materials?
Yeah, absolutely. We just got a phase 2 funding from them. So phase 1 was very successful. We were able to accelerate the qualification of 3 materials. Now, when I say accelerate the qualification, in DoD and defense worlds, there's something called TRL, Technology Readiness Level, or MRL, Manufacturing Readiness Level, Material Readiness Level, which are the criteria to how mature a material or a product is before it gets used in defense applications. Usually, achieving TRL like that takes years. You gradually roll it out, you have it tested in the field, you do low-rate initial production, you have a few programs, and 5 years later, you have a material that reaches something like TRL 9, which is the highest maturity. DLA, Defense Logistics Agency, understood we don't have 5 years for this, and so teamed up with us to create a special program that accelerates the manufacturing readiness level of these materials, funded fully by Defense Logistics Agency, which is part of DoD, and implemented by LightPath to accelerate the adoptness, the manufacturing readiness, and scaling up of the manufacturing of these materials so that today already they can be used. And here we are now where these materials are in programs of record already, or being designed into new applications to replace germanium, to outperform germanium also in some cases. But we did it in a matter of 2 years instead of 5.
Yeah, well, I think that's the headline here, is how much quicker you're able to adapt to this versus somebody who's got I know you've hit the ground running. So this important chemical, I guess it's a chemical, right? So
well, it's a glass. It's a composition of multiple chemicals together, and it's a foresight of Defense Logistics Agency and some people in DoD that already years ago understood those materials need to be developed, and they give a shout out to the researchers at naval research laboratories that did that for many years, and to the people at Defense Logistics Agency that had the vision to finance this already 2 years ago to prepare for this day.
Yeah. Well, Sam, thank you so much for coming and explaining this and educating us on germanium and its importance in terms of national security and our economy.
Absolutely. Thank you, Jane.
Thank you.